Good evening all. I am Barney Fryer. I'm the Loch Kent Trust Officer. I'm your host for this evening's exciting event. Funny weather we're having. What does it mean and what are we going to do about it in Galloway? So I, as your host for the evening, will just run through a few of the housekeeping and mechanics, give you a short introduction, and then I'll hand you over to the main event. We will have opportunity for debate, chat, and hopefully some lively conversation at the end of the evening. What we'll have is we'll have two speakers, then the debate. We are recording the session, but it will only be the speakers and the slides that get recorded, and that will be uploaded to the Galloway Glens YouTube channel and Loch Kent Trust YouTube channel once we've got the video sorted. We will try and take questions as we go through the chat function. So could I ask you all, please, just to familiarize yourself with the chat function, it'd be great if you introduce yourself, say a little hello, and maybe where you're from. Because I think we've got some people from, obviously plenty of local people, but I think we've got a few people from further afield. I think that's just about it for the boring housekeeping elements. We have no emergencies or alarms or alerts planned for the evening. If you hear a fire alarm, it's probably your own house. So deal with that as a priority. Right, on to the introductions then. So we're really, really excited for tonight's event. We've been planning for this for quite a while. This is part of our Climate Ready Ken project. And the Climate Ready Ken project is a partnership between Loch Kent Trust and Adaptation Scotland. For those of you who don't know, Loch Kent Trust is a relatively new charity. We've been set up to support sustainable local communities in the Loch Kent area. And climate change being the issue that it is obviously a key part of that. So we were selected to be part of the Adaptation Scotland's Climate Ready Localities programme, and that's what Climate Ready Kent is all about. What it is it's nothing to do with reducing our carbon emissions. Vital though that is, it's hugely important that we make serious reductions in our carbon emissions. What the Climate Ready Ken project is about the often forgotten other side of tackling climate change, climate adaptation, or dealing with the inevitable changes that are coming, that are here now, to be perfectly frank. And with COP26 being very fresh in people's minds, it's worth pointing out that if we do really well, if all of the nations that were at COP26 achieve all of the pledges that they have made, if everyone does everything they've promised to do, we are on a track at the moment to see 2.4 degrees global temperature rise by the end of the century. That brings with it a huge amount of change, challenge, and disruption. The one thing we have to do is face what's coming, and it would be foolish to do anything other. Now that will bring risks and opportunities, and what we're going to hear about tonight is some more of that. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this right now. That's really all I wanted to make the point of, that this is about what's here and what's coming and getting ready to deal with it. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to our first speaker, and many of you know him. So our first speaker is Jeff Monk from the Lauriston Weather Centre. And as I say, Jeff is well known to many of the people here, and he will be talking about exciting things about his expertise, and then we'll move to Arena later. So that's enough from me, and I'll hand over to Jeff. Jeff.
Hello, I'm just going through the motions of sharing screen. So if you'll just bear with me for a moment, and hopefully you can see a weather chart, which is a very good place for a meteorologist to start. So yeah, I'm Jeff Monk. For those of you who don't know the Weather Centre, there has been a weather forecasting centre here for, well, 30 odd years. Roland Chaplin first started it off in the mid 1980s. I have continued it whilst I've been up here over the last 22 years. And just in the background, nothing to do with tonight, is a weather chart for this Friday, which looks like being very interesting weather if you happen to be in the northern half of Scotland. But there we are. So as far as tonight is concerned, we're going to look at climate change. Clearly, having been interested in the weather from a very young age indeed, the fact that there might be, and we'll come to that in a moment, that there might be changes in the weather has always been very close to the way I think about things. And so I wanted to share with you a few things over the next few minutes. So you were asked a question when you booked in about whether you feel that the weather in Galloway has in fact changed. I'm not going to refer to the answers. I have seen the answers. I'm not going to refer to the answers specifically, but I'm going to ask the question, should we be looking at our ideas of what we think has happened, which I've called memories, or should we be looking at the numbers to indicate to what extent climate change has happened? This question came out as we chatted about the meeting a couple of weeks ago. I said that last Wednesday afternoon, I was going to talk about the weather to a retirement group in Castle Douglas, very well retired actually. And to get the sort of ball rolling and chatting, when I speak to a retirement group, I always ask the same question first. And it's quite simply, what was the weather like when you were children? And the answer, as on other occasions, but particularly last Wednesday, came back very strongly. The summers were warm and sunny, we're talking about Galloway, and the winters were cold and snowy. But I am going to suggest that we may have skewed memories, because our memories go back to the occasions when we were outside thoroughly enjoying ourselves in the summer, taking a dip in the sea, in the loch or whatever, on beautiful days, and we do not remember summer or winter, the holiday days when we simply had to play board games or cards or whatever, or annoy our parents or whatever we're doing because we were stuck inside in pouring rain all day. Those days go away. They get forgotten. So I think we've got to be very careful about how we remember the weather. Some of us will get used to as it's been over the last decade or so, and perhaps forget that there has been slight changes. If there's been changes, we'll come to that in a moment. Whilst others of us will go back to our salad days, as it were, to use an old phrase, during childhood, and think, well, the weather's just generally worse now. A second thing about memories is there may appear to be changes because of something that we have done. Think of our burns, our rivers, and a lot of our burns are called lanes because they've been straightened out artificially in the past. In the past, field drains were put into many fields. Some of these field drains will have silted up. Some of these lanes will have silted up. Some of the fact that we put these lanes in, that we straighten out rivers and burns, means that we actually change the way that they wiggle downstream, and this can have an impact. So it is possible that maybe over the last 20 years, every time it rains heavily, water runs past our back door simply because man-made changes from the past have now in themselves been changed. Say, think of the field drains. Certainly here in Lauriston, there's evidence that some of them have just filled in, and close to the Crockett Memorial here, certainly we get running water over the last decade or two, where previously there was not. So we've got to be very careful about calculating for ourselves the amount of climate change. One thing that I was going to say was briefly, I looked at a photograph of rockery on our garden going back 20 years, and it looks so different now, and you actually forget it looks different. Trees grow so slowly, you get used to them. So we've got to look at the science. We've got to look at observations. I've got here in the office observations from Hensel Estate going back to the second decade of the 20th century, rainfall, maximum temperature, minimum temperature every day. So we've got to look at those, see how things are changing. On a bigger scale outside Galloway, there will be series of observations in major places like Edinburgh, down at Kew in England, which go back even further from the time that reliable scientific instrumentation started. We can go back further with what we call surrogate observations. A study called phenology looks at, and somebody picked this up in their answer, to the question about people record the day that the first apple blossom formed or the first daffodil flowered, going way, way back. Often it's sort of academics going back to the 16th, 17th century, and over a few decades they note these. So we can see whether there's been any change to the length of the growing season. Go back further, we can look at the width of annual tree rings, where was there warm periods and things like that. So out of these long periods of observations, one or two things for Galloway and probably for the UK generally begin to show. One of them is that the number of days in which snow is lying has decreased markedly. There is a longer growing season and there is higher rainfall generally, although it might not rain for very much longer, if longer at all. The difference is very much in the intensity. So another quick question, how new is climate change? People talk about little ice ages and warm periods, but the evidence is from these tree rings and going back further, didn't mention ice cores and things like that, we know that these warmer or colder periods are regional on the scale of the globe. In other words, maybe half or quarter the size of Europe. They are not global. In terms of warming, the climate is as warm, if not warmer, than it has been for the last 20,000 years or more now, only marginally so. Perhaps the little ice ages, particularly, were picked up in the past because with most people sort of really living from hand to mouth, 3 or 4 years, perhaps in 10, instead of 1 or 2, where there are particularly prolonged cold winters, may well have led to a marked increase in the mortality rate, and thus a memory within that generation, which then gets passed down. So a little bit of a question mark about little ice ages. They do not show up that clearly when you look at the numbers. So we're talking about cycles. Some of these are just, say, decadal cycles. Instead of 1 or 2 cold years, particularly cold years in 10, occasionally we might get 3 or 4. Annual cycles, I've got 5 years there, 68, 75, 83, 95, 2021. Those 5 years were very, very similar. Cold late springs, suddenly going into lovely summers. And the weather patterns were quite constant for periods. And that has happened around the Northern Hemisphere this year. It's been one of those years where instead, if you like, of areas of low pressure belting across the Atlantic from the eastern seaboard of the United States, finishing up between Scotland and Iceland, although that is happening much more now, late autumn, for most of the year, it hasn't happened at all. The weather systems have taken a much more circuitous route and have been tending to stick in the same place. So for periods, we've had high pressure for a long time. We had a period with almost constant, relatively low pressure over Europe during the summer. Rainfall was very, very high. The Danube and the Rhine rose, and then eventually, all of a sudden, were some real thunderstorms on top, and all that catastrophic flooding, I think, North Germany into Belgium. Similarly, that same sinusoidal pattern, we'll call it, meandering pattern, had an impact over the Rocky Mountains. So there's just no flow of air around there at all. So high-level heat sources over Rocky Mountains, nothing to take the heat away, it just built up, and there was those exceptional temperatures. So 2021 fits a pattern of unusual summers or rare-ish summers, but they're nothing new. In fact, I would say this year was most similar to 1968, in which was notable for the further northwest in Britain you went, the drier and sunnier it was. That was not a summer for southern England. Now let's go to seasonal cycles, winters. Februaries. When I did my degree in meteorology in the early 1970s, the professor said Februaries are one of the driest and, I'm going to use a technical term, most blocked months. Blocking simply means the southwesterly winds don't come in. In other words, we don't have the progression of low pressure systems across the Atlantic. That has not been the case in the last few decades. What has been the case in the last few decades is that February has been a continuation of the frequently wet weather through November, December and January. So that has meant, instead of February generally being a dry month, it being a wet month, our winters are finishing up very much wetter. Last couple of years, I think the rain stopped more or less at the end of February last year, but it was mid-March the year before. Then we go into spring. I talked about, just going back, a little bit of written evidence going back to the Middle Ages of weather patterns. And I read one fairly recently where a few places, not necessarily in Scotland, but mostly in England, where there is circumstantial evidence of very dry springs in the 14th century, which made it very difficult to find fodder for the cattle in the early summer. Seemingly, by the time harvest came, everything had got back to normal and the harvests were fine. So some of the dry springs we have been having from March onwards are not unusual. They're in the records. So that's not necessarily changed. One of the things I put at the bottom as a memorandum for me, 2021, May, was cold and wet, and then immediately summer set in, which is like those other years I mentioned. But actually, the thing to me about this year has been July, not so much August, but September, October, and November until this week have consistently been very warm. There's been some rain, there's been a lot of cloud, so you've probably not noticed it that much. You know, it's not as if we've been baking under sunshine, but the daytime temperatures have been consistently well above normal. And as a meteorologist, that long term, but not, if you like, exceptional, you know, in terms of enjoyable weather, is far more important than the odd really hot day, such as we had in July. Let's come to Galloway. Lost it again. Yeah, there we are. Okay. It's a little warmer. The sea temperatures, which have a bearing, a strong bearing on what weather we get, are a touch warmer, but generally speaking, over the last few decades, although it has got warmer, it is not exceptional. In fact, I would suggest that some of the warming, certainly a significant part of the warming, is due to the latter end of those winters, those Februaries, if you like, being warmer than they used to be. We're not getting the long, cold, frosty periods in February. I've highlighted the rain. It's wetter, particularly inland toward the hills. In a moment, and I don't know whether this works, I've never tried this before, comments would be gratefully received. I'm going to do a comparison with a famous but very different part of the world. Sunshine and wind. The jury is perhaps out at this stage, whether it will get sunnier or cloudier. There is some evidence that the Atlantic will get more cloudy during the summer and autumn in westerly winds if the air coming in off the Atlantic, off the American continent is warmer. More cloud will result. Wind, not sure. Just as a slight diversion, again, going back to my university days, the same professor suggested that there would be an increase in hurricanes in the tropics if the sea temperatures rose. That was wrong. It hasn't happened, not statistically significantly. What has happened is that those hurricanes that form, more of them are at the top of the range in terms of wind speed. In other words, we have categories. Top categories are 4 and 5. We are seeing more of those, and they are surviving more up into our sort of latitudes. Might that be happening to the intense little lows, and we're going to have one over northern Scotland on Friday, that happen in middle latitudes? Might there be just as many deep lows, but may more of them have intense cores of strong winds, which are associated with some of our damaging very deep lows. Deep lows, we call them as hurricane force winds. And that was some of the research I was involved in my Met Office days. So let's go back very quickly to compare Galloway with, let's see if I can actually get this to play. Yes, right. I'm going to compare Galloway with Western India, of all places. Now, I've put 2 arrows on that map. Galloway's in the middle, just above the Isle of Man, to which there is a long arrow. Now, think of loads of one after another low pressure areas across the Atlantic, crossing either northern Scotland or further north than that. The air goes round anti-clockwise. As the low and the rain comes in, the wind changes to become more southerly. But something that happens because of the hills, and this map has got the high ground marked in orangey colours, because of the hills of Ireland, south of Dublin, and also the Welsh hills, the air tends to be diverted a little bit to get to us more directly up the Irish Sea, whereas it may come into Western Scotland, the dashed arrow, a little bit more southwesterly. I've probably overdone the difference, actually. Indeed, in my meteorological office days, I spent a few months forecasting at RAF Valley on Anglesey, and you could see this dearth of southwesterly winds in their wind records. It flipped from almost westerly right round to south-southwest. So we get more than our fair share of winds with a very, very long sea track all the way across the Atlantic. So Ireland does not have the mediating effect that one would think it might do. So lots of wind when it's in this direction and the rain's coming in. We get the heaviest of rain when it's slightly more southwest. It is allowed to be a little bit more southwest. It heads into Cumbria, Dumfriesshire and the borders, as happened just a few weeks ago. These air masses coming up from the south are labelled, there's a bit of meteorology here which I won't go into because you're going to tell me that the temperatures I'm giving it as an air mass are a little bit higher than actually happens, and that's because near the ground, the lowest few hundred metres, it's cooled a little bit by the sea. But these air masses come in with a characteristic temperature of around 16, maybe a little bit lower as we get to February, March. There's our rainfall map of Britain Met Office. You can see that the big rainfall is over Western Scotland, Lake District, Snowdon, and we're a little bit lower, as I say, higher than you might think, because Ireland's actually in the way of what we would call the prevailing southwesterly winds. I'm going to compare that very quickly with Western India. What happens there? It only rains for 3 months of the year between June and September, but constantly they have a wind coming in from the west-southwest, but that's labelled with a temperature of 28, which is about 12, 14 degrees higher. Much longer than the mountain mass, but it's about the same height, most of it, some bigger mountains in the south, but forget those. But broadly speaking, you can compare it. That blue is the mass of rain along the west coast and the western hills, which is above 2,500 millimetres a year, 100 millimetres, and in places it doubles that. So that's far more than we get in a year. So the basic message I'm trying to say is that, oddly, the science says that you only have to rise the temperature slightly and you get much more rain out of it. Now, we are never going to get these phenomenal amounts of rain, several inches, hundreds of millimetres per day, that we're going to get in that India gets every year, the Gap Mountains in the west. But what it does say is that the slight difference in temperatures of the air mass we're now getting is punching far above its weight in making, as the air comes inland over the gradually rising air, or releasing would be a better word, turrets of deep, what we call convection, which results in sudden bursts of heavy rain. So put the temperature up only slightly, and there are far more of these bursts of heavy rain. Indeed, in the monsoon in India, not only is it heavy rain, it's thunder and lightning, and the top of the clouds are right up at 10, 12 kilometers high. We don't get that, and even the changes that we're getting will just take us slightly in that direction. So I am comparing something very different, but I'm suggesting that there is a direction that we might be going in. So again, my machine has stuck and I cannot get out of it, and it will not. It's jumped on. That's good. So some concluding thoughts. Rainfall is the major player in Galloway in terms of climate change. I didn't talk about snow and ice very much, other than say that the number of days of snow lying has dropped. But because cold weather in the winter, and particularly that decrease in February's, only just happens, a very slight change overly affects the number of snow and ice days. In other words, if you were in Scandinavia or northern Russia or somewhere, whatever you did in the winter, it's so cold, there's going to be months of ice-covered lakes and snow-covered land. But because we only just get to that temperature, a slight warming cuts out a lot of the icy days. I think it's 10 years since I've seen people playing ice hockey on Woodhall Loch and sort of run across it or whatever. Whereas in the first few years up here, it seemed to freeze over deep enough to walk on at least half the winters. So that's a very recent change. I've explained the longer wet winters in terms of February. So just a few personal thoughts following COP. They talked a lot about targets, 2030, 2040, 2050 is the big one. That's something very much for organisations, for governments. I am minded to think in terms of individual, what we can do, what communities can do to bring about change broadly. As people living in the UK, if you like, we are using per person 2 to 3 Earths, if you like, 2 or 3 times the Earth's resources. So that's not sustainable. We need to bring that down, perhaps to 1 and 1.5, and then hopefully technology, which is developing, will do the rest. And we're looking at renewables. Yeah, they've come very much cheaper. Yeah, the more we can put solar stuff where it's best used. We've had solar panels on our roof for 10 years. Wow, if we have them in the tropics, we'd get three times more energy out of them. So there's lots of thinking where best to put renewables, different types of renewables. So those are some of my sort of thoughts. But whatever. At every level, individuals, communities, whatever, we need to mitigate, but tonight now is going to be very much about adaptation. And that's me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jeff. So a big thank you for that. It was very interesting, some things I certainly hadn't thought about. Just to really drive the point home, I don't disagree with anything Jeff said at the end there, but we will be talking tonight not about how we reduce our emissions, vital though that is. We're talking tonight about how we get ready for the changes that are here and the changes that are coming. So we're just going to take a very brief moment. So don't be shy about putting things in the chat, but I only saw one real question come through as you were talking. So I will take a moment to ask you that one, Jeff, which is...
I can see it.
You see it?
Yeah,
so just for anyone who hasn't seen it, I'll say he's asking how we can know, how we can be sure that the Little Ice Age and the warm periods were regional. So I'll give that one to Jeff.
Because we have looked at things in different parts of the world, like ice cores, Greenland, Antarctica. We have compared 3 rings so that we get a proper record going back in different continents. And the the main body of science suggests that there is no evidence of global change. As I explained, the evidence seemed to be that they were on a much smaller scale, part of a continent, maybe probably on a bigger scale than Britain, but not certainly not a global scale.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jeff. So if you could just mute yourself now, and then we'll move on to the second presentation. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Irina from Adaptation Scotland and Sniffer, the organisation that runs that. So Irina's been working with us very much as part of the Climate Ready Ken project, and now we're starting to think about that. What are we going to do about this? So Jeff's really given us a good intro to the sort of changes we have seen and what we can expect to see more of. But the crux of this project, the real measure of the success of Climate Ready Ken, is what are we going to do differently? So on that, I'll hand over to Irina.
Cool. Thank you so much, Barney. And hello and welcome, everyone. Yeah, my name is Irina Zamrueva, and I'm working with the sustainability charity Sniffer that, yeah, as Barney said, will run Adaptation Scotland program, through which we are working together with Barney and the rest of the organizations whose logos you see over here on the Climate Ready Can project. So that's sort of the reason and the connection why I'm here today. Let me see if this is gonna work. There we go. Yeah, so just to recap, I guess what Jeff was talking us through, the kind of the many changes that we're already seeing that are happening now and that will continue to intensify are firstly the temperatures that are increasing, the extreme weather that is increasing, the heavy winter rainfall and reduced summer rainfall, the sea level rise and the coastal erosion, and the increased likelihood of flooding that comes with that. And there we go. So yeah, what are the responses, kind of, right? What is the big question of tonight? How are we dealing with this? And many times Barney said we're not going to talk about mitigation or reducing the emissions so much, but it's very, I think, yeah, important to frame why exactly is that, right? So mitigation or reducing the emissions is very much about limiting the amount of greenhouse gases that we are putting into the atmosphere. So carbon, methane, and all of those things. And this means many things like phasing out fossil fuels, taking different measures to reduce these emissions, and is often referred to as mitigation. And examples of these actions do include reducing kind of different energy efficiency measures, renewable energy generation, switching to non-fossil fuels-based public transport and ways of heating homes. But what I want to say is that it's absolutely crucial to engage in these at local, regional, and national levels. But the thing with climate change is that even if we were to reduce our emissions overnight, which isn't happening, we are already stuck with the changes that are set in motion over the past couple of 100 years and that have intensified with the Industrial Revolution. So keeping up mitigation efforts is key and is absolutely vital to avoid climate chaos, but it is knowing how actually climate change is affecting the places that we live in, how it will be changing in the future, and what we can do to adapt and understand how it will be affecting all of us so that we can prepare for that. So that's the other part of the story that we're going to be talking about, this adaptation to adapting to the changes that are taking place now and will be continuing to take place in the future. So I guess, what is adaptation? So that's pretty much about responding to the changes that we see in our climate and that we have seen in the past few decades. And it is not just about reacting to them, so reacting to them is part of them, but it's actually changing how we live, how we work, in a way to become less vulnerable and living better lives in general. So it's very much about preparing to the challenges that we will face. So kind of being able to anticipate and imagine and plan collectively as our climate continues to change. So you might be wondering now why communities should be adapting. Many reasons for that. I'll talk us through a few of those. So adaptation is already happening to an extent at a regional or national level, but increasingly we as individuals, community groups, active people need to understand and adapt to these changes as well. And adaptation is not like a single group's project. No one can solve it by themselves. It's not just about government doing something, or just kind of some particular groups of people about doing something, but it's really about figuring out how to share responsibility for creating a better future in the changing climate across local, regional, national actors that do need to work together across those scales. And this is where local knowledge and lived experience is so vital and valuable, because it's, yeah, this is our places are where we are actually experiencing climate change, right? And adaptation obviously is not a tick box to kind of check and move on, because for better for worse, we are stuck with this for a while now. So the impacts of climate change aren't these abstract things happening somewhere else already, as Jeff was talking to us about, as many of you also mentioned in the registration form as well, right? There are right here in our streets, fields, highlands, lowlands, all around us. So we see that there have been more frequent and more intense flooding of people's homes, businesses, properties, with most vulnerable people struggling to cope with its effects. So adaptation is, in that context, is about learning who and actually how is affected in your area and protecting them. And another one might sound a bit unusual for Scotland, but we do see increased heat and droughts in summer leading to water shortages, for example. So it's the same logic here, with adaptation being about learning who and how is vulnerable to those droughts and heat, and understanding how those people and places might be protected. So this basically is to say that climate change will most severely and most quickly impact the most vulnerable in our societies and our communities, both people and other living beings. So adaptation is also ultimately a social justice issue. And another one to keep in mind is that different places in Scotland and in the world will experience different changes at different times. But the baseline is that the earlier we adapt, the greater an opportunity we have to create a positive future. And adaptation is never really, it's never only about adaptation, so to speak. It has many benefits to many things. In like policy terms, it's often referred to as like co-benefits, but it's basically to say that when people, groups, communities engage in adaptation actions, they often bring about other benefits that are linked to emission reductions or health benefits or things. To give you a couple of examples, like improving livestock health at farms will have benefits for both mitigation and adaptation, as healthy animals will be more resilient to climate change. Or healthy peatland, as promoted for mitigation, as carbon sinks would reduce runoff, which in the end would reduce flood risk. Or eating healthy diet that is rich in locally grown fruits and vegetables that are grown locally in season where we live. This increases obviously dependency on the global food supply that might be disrupted by climate change, and also is obviously just a good, healthy way to eat. And a final example to give here is that resilient public transport, for example, where if we are creating accessible and non-fossil fuels-based public transport, this also contributes to both emission reductions and adaptation by ensuring that these kind of public transports are designed in an accessible and climate-proof way. So in sum, it makes a lot of sense from all perspectives. And two, we all had very different and difficult experiences, of course, of the past year and a half, however long it's been. It feels like much longer, of course. But we've seen the effects from the COVID-19 and how much vulnerability it has exposed that it exists in our communities. But it also has been an example of how we have adapted in many ways very quickly and have seen the inequalities and the value of forward planning for the things that we know are highly likely to occur in the future, like the pandemics, like climate change, and all of the changes that it calls upon. So I want to talk a bit about kickstarting local and locally led adaptation, and talk us through a bit what are the kind of activities, methods, resources to begin this process. And first one being kind of first element of step is when we think about, okay, how do we kind of downscale this like massive topic of adaptation to something that is doable and manageable? And the first big step is understanding actually how climate change is already experienced in your area. in terms of people, places, vulnerabilities. And this is what we are doing with Climate Ready Can project already. Here's a couple of photos from the event that we had in August at the Castle Douglas Bike and Food Festival, where we had this map and we tried to ask people and see what in people's opinion made Lough area vulnerable to climate change and what made it resilient. And that obviously allowed us to see specific themes, topics that were especially relevant for the area. Oops. There we go. Then another important element to consider is thinking through the activities that people do in the area and how these specific activities will be affected by climate change. So how will they affect you, your spaces, your homes, work, families, communities? And of course, every community, every area will have their own special constellation of those concerns and effects. And in Lough area, what we're hearing a lot is obviously it's a very predominantly rural area. So thinking about the implications of farms, farming communities, farming businesses. There's tourism, also lots of reliance on tourism. So thinking what changing seasons and weather patterns would mean for tourism. There's lots of implications for mobility or lack of public accessible and available public transport. So those are just some examples of how we might downscale and think more of what actually climate change means, rather than thinking that it's this abstract thing out there, but looking at the things that we do and how it affects those. Another important element is coming together to acknowledge and overcome the risks. What you might need to change more permanently to avoid these risks in the future. So then it becomes not just about thinking about temperature change or flooding in abstract, but it's actually thinking about, okay, who might be harmed because of this? And the kind of questions we're asking here is like who and how in the area will be affected by warmer, wetter winters, for example, and hotter and dry summers, and what can be done about it. So there's many ways to do it. At the very basic, it's about making a list of risks associated with changing climate for the community and thinking how often they occur, how significant the impact will be, and there are tools to help to do this, and there are organizations that can support you in doing that. And this is where we think about the older folks, younger people, women, or people that might have been historically marginalized, and the environments that are especially at risk. And it's very much about considering what is already in the place and what can be built upon. So what groups might there already be trying to deal with these issues locally? Does local authority have some plans already to deal with this? Does, any other active groups basically in the area dealing with this? So we have talked about risks, but also there's another side to climate change for some areas. So it's about also coming together to think about the opportunities that a changing climate and adapting society might create in your community. So will warmer summers mean that you can grow different crops and produce more food locally, for example? Or could adjusting the local tourism offer bring in more regional visitors and different seasons for different activities? And of course, it's also about creating and bringing to life a community action plan that includes climate change, both adaptation and mitigation. So there's no blueprint, as every community has a different challenges, different sets of risks, opportunities, but it will likely be a summary of how climate change is and will be affecting your area. What are you going to do to adapt to the new conditions and the actions and resources you need to adapt? And this plan can be used to help communicate these impacts and actions to your community members and people on the outside. This can be used to leverage the resources that you need to implement the actions in your plan and serve as this sort of like communication and accountability device. And this is pretty much what the Lough Trust is already doing with putting together the Lough plan, where we're trying to see how climate change and adaptation can be fitted into it. So just to give a few examples of what kind of actions might end up in such a plan, or just think in general what might be these local actions. And there's many ways of thinking about them here. I'm going to talk you through a few examples at the community planning level, at the natural environment and the built environment level, but there's many ways to kind of think about these. So at the community planning level, there's simple things that can be done, like establishing community response team to assist with local emergency planning, provide advice, create a local contact network and plan of action, and keep the topic of climate change and adaptation on the local agenda even. So this on one hand builds the capacity within the community to be on guard for extreme weather and climate emergencies, and also provides the capacity to support emergency services and councils to respond to these. And another example of such an action is undertake a community mapping of local assets. So it's something different to what we've done from the photos that I was showing earlier, where we've mapped just sort of some of the impacts of climate change. And this is about gathering local data that can help you assess your climate vulnerability. So what you can map here is the local assets that are important for the community, like local food delivery services or community parks, so gyms or public gathering spaces, libraries, all those kind of things. There's lots of things that can be done at the built assets level, from things like installing rainwater harvesting system that reduce runoff water during storms, and also is a way of reducing dependency on water supplies in case of water shortages and droughts. There's actions around creating permeable surfaces, places that can absorb water from storms and floods. You can also install flood resilience measures at your own properties, or ask your landlords to take care of this, which means installing, for example, water resistance finishes in ground floor areas, or ceramic flooring, or many other kind of technical ways of dealing with it. And there is maintenance things like checking windows and doors and guttering and exposed buildings, fabric, and maintaining and upgrading them. And actions that can be taken in the kind of natural environment domain. Lots of things, again here, like creating shelter beds using trees and hedgerows and fences. So this also has multiple benefits, like reducing soil erosion, but also preventing damage to crops and protecting farm buildings. Creation and maintaining of wetlands, that is amazing habitat in itself, but also reduces the flow rate of water, and in that alleviate flood risk. And also things like establishing a group of volunteers to help prevent and respond to wildfires. So for example, community partnerships with local fire and rescue services to provide training and equipment. So yeah, this sort of, you can go on with this kind of list for a long time, but it's a matter of, communities coming together and agreeing what are the things that are actually priorities, what are most important, who are the people and places that are most at risk. So it's very kind of, very interconnected issues. And as I said, adaptation is never only about sort of adaptation per se, but these actions mostly also contribute to the well-being of people and ecosystems in the area. And I think, as I already mentioned, that it's never starting from scratch. I think it's, it might seem like not much maybe is going on in the area, but there's often existing groups who might not call themselves like climate change or adaptation groups, but what they're doing is already very much aligned with what is needed in terms of adaptation. And finally, just to share a few examples of what adaptation actions are already happening at different levels across Scotland. So there are currently the pilot trials of the place standard tool with the climate lens, which is this structured way to have conversation about how different elements of place, like safety, mobility, resources, sense of control, and others are affected by climate change, and what can be done, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation. So it's happening in like Aberdeenshire, Glasgow, Edinburgh 5, and a few other places. Scottish Flood Forum also helps facilitate and establish community flood resilience groups. There's Cars of Gorey Sustainability Group in Perth and Kinross that have been doing some really interesting work in using open source GIS software and community knowledge to build an accurate map of the local area, focusing on mapping local assets and recording flood events. There's been some also interesting cooperation in the Scottish Border Council, where they have provided community groups with advice on flood risk in conjunctions with the Flood Protection Forum. And this group now take advice door to door, sort of helping residents understand if they live in a flood risk zone and see what can be done about that. Yeah, there has been some actions in Argyll and Bute on future-proofing community buildings, and in Aberdeen on collecting rainwater from the roofs in the from the roof for use in the building themselves. So yeah, maybe there's a few more examples, but I think it's, as you can see, there's very kind of specific things that can be done in different communities depending on the challenges. There are some communities that are now working to produce their local climate change plans or climate emergency plans they refer to, some focusing on just mitigation, but it's of course important to take care of the adaptation side of things too. I think that was all I had to say. Yeah, this is kind of, Climate Ready Ken, again, if this is kind of, I guess, the gathering place for all of these thoughts and ideas and activities with the Loch and Trust project. And if there's any questions on adaptation that you want to discuss or think about or further, there's some more contact details. And to finish with a picture of the Loch Ken and a little quote of "when the wind of change blows, ... and maybe we can leave it at that and have a conversation. What do we do when the winds of change blow? So there's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arena. This is an issue that is really, really close to my heart. I moved up to work at Loch Ken from Todmorden in the Calder Valley in West Yorkshire. So this is towns like Hebden Bridge, Mythenroyd, Todmorden. You may have seen them on the national news. We got hit so severely in the Boxing Day floods of 2015. It's a very steep-sided valley, and we have dealt with some really extreme weather events. And I just wanted to take a moment just to remember that there is a human face at the end of these events. And being involved in the cleanup after that extreme flood, when I was essentially taking people's life belongings, everything they owned, in the back of my van to the tip to throw it away, knowing that they had no way to replace it. They couldn't get insurance, they couldn't afford it, even if they could get it. It was genuinely heartbreaking work. At its heart, this project is about not what the council will do, not what the government will do, what will you do to prepare for what is coming and what is already here? And how can we all support each other to get through whatever's coming down the line? I'll get things started with, there was one message that came through direct to me, which I'd like to just forward to Jeff first, which was a specific one about, do you have any knowledge of how many times, this is about rainfall intensity. So do you have any knowledge of how many times we're getting more than 30 millimeters in an hour or 80 millimeters in a 24-hour period? If anyone's going to know, you will, Jeff.
Almost never. I mean, but I mean, it depends where you are. If you sit in one of these gale force southerly winds and you sit under Corsorine, you may well get those amounts. There isn't a precise answer to that one.
Fair enough. If we take the specific numbers out and we just talk more generally about the intensity, and I've seen a bit of chat going through about intensity, what we're seeing is more intense rainfall, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think we've all experienced that to a greater or lesser extent. I know I certainly have.
I would love to come in, Barney. There was a question about cloudiness, about data in Galloway showing there were fewer hours of sunshine than before. I don't know whether that rung anything true with Jeff.
I suspect the evidence is a little bit weak. Yeah, we have had longer months of basically Atlantic winds in the winter, which would reduce sunshine, but actually you get so little in the winter time anyway. I can only think that that's relatively little. Again, thinking about February is probably that's dropped. But again, I put question marks because, yeah, I suspect there is a little bit less sun, but if you did some numbers on it, I suspect it's what we call not statistically significant.
Thanks, Jeff. Anyone else got any questions I want to come in at this point?
Barney.
Hi, Ian.
Barney, as one of the local councillors, I was glad to hear consideration. What can we do ourselves? A constant irritation to the likes of me is when I get somebody reporting the drain outside my house is blocked. what are you going to do about it? And my answer would be, well, what are you going to do about it? Instead of waiting for a much reduced workforce to come round, there are simple tasks that people can do to help clear excess rainwater in front. So it's simple matters like that. I was surprised to see that there was a suggestion that we would have volunteer firefighters dealing with forest fires. I'm not entirely sure about that. I wouldn't really expect people to do that, but surely something like clearing a drain in front of your property isn't really too much to ask. By the time you could clear it quicker than you can reporting it.
Absolutely, and just this is not simply a question of politics, although the point Ian makes about the resources available to the council are reduced. And on that, I will just mention, I once had a conversation with an officer from Kirklees Council in Yorkshire, who just after an extreme rainfall event he was in a real bad way, because he had essentially just lost £1 million out of his budget in terms of the cleanup costs, because they had no option but to deal with the cleanup costs of that extreme weather event. It was costs no one had budgeted for, and they certainly didn't have it. But on a more practical level, and this is something we used to see in the Calder Valley, is Todmorden, where I moved from, is 3 valleys coming together. And in some of our extreme weather events, we were literally cut off. There was no way for anyone to get in or out. So the only people you have to depend on are the people who are there. So I'll give you an example of something that might not be obvious. When it comes to flooding, you quite often have people talking about putting floodboards on the doorways of your home, of your property. And again, I come back to my experience in the Calder Valley, and we've got floodboards installed on all kinds of properties along there. And some of the people at the lowest lying houses faced a really interesting challenge, that the flood sirens were going off to give them the warning, and we genuinely did have air raid sirens in the Calder Valley to alert us to the flood coming. So people put their floodboards in, and that's brilliant. And the people who live by one of the main roads find that the drivers are going through too fast, sending tidal waves of water which are overtopping their floodboards. I use that merely as an example to say it's not just the hard engineering, it's also the understanding of the ways we have to change how we behave, how we operate. McNabb, you're being very polite as well.
I just wanted to throw one thing in to ask Irina a question, really, which was, you've talked there about what could be done to adapt, but has there ever been any, if the world is still run by money, has there ever been any studies about what adaptation saves us? Is there a cash saving that comes from adaptation, whether it be for local authority or for economic impact or anything? Has there ever been something that would help this discussion?
No, there are plenty of studies. Like, I won't be able to cite any from the top of my head, but it is a difficult one to sort of, if we are still kind of living in the world where lots of things have to be justified to this kind of financial lens, adaptation is much more difficult to put into those financial terms, because it's sort of, you don't see effects of these kind of immediately, and that's why kind of it's much more difficult to engage with with your imagination and evaluate in financial terms. But for sure, kind of it needs much more time to see that kind of that investment is the preventative spend, essentially, and that is a more difficult one to prove, but that one that needs to be made the case for, because of course, preventative spend helps you save, like Barney's story just now helps you save whole lots of money in the future. But yeah, I can share some links to those, because especially for the local authorities, I think that's a very relevant.
And again, just to bring this back to the project that is Climate Ready Kent and the work we as Loch-in Trust are trying to do, we are not suggesting for a minute that we're sitting here with all the answers. We're saying, you are our community. We are here to support you and us to work together to make this better. What do you need? Is it lists of installers? Is it more information? What is it that would help you? And I see Sarah in the chat talking about being flooded and also not having no water supply, and then how to get good advice on the best solutions to go for. So again, if we need to know which companies can give us these hard engineering solutions, and then we marry it with how do we get the information. The example that I always use, that some of you will have heard me say before, is if we have to evacuate one of our villages, whose job is it to make sure that Mrs. Miggins at number 3, who doesn't have a car, gets a seat in someone else's car? Who's got the checklist? Who is doing this thing? What do we do when the trouble hits? The time to build your castle walls is before the army is at your gate. And with that rather dramatic analogy, I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who's got his hand up.
One or two of you might know me as the Land Use and Biodiversity Officer with the Biosphere, and I'm also an ex-planning officer of Hackneyed planning officer of many years. And the amount of developments that I've seen being approved, kind of some with too much hard surfacing, but these days developers have to put in calculations to show that they won't make the situation any worse, or maybe won't even make it better. But it's a point that Irina made about hard surfaces that people put into gardens. If you think of how much water, if you've got a rain harvesting barrel, if you think of how much water comes off your garage or off your house roof and how quickly that fills up, how quickly that can fill up, then you multiply it by thousands and hundreds of thousands of houses that have increased their hard paving throughout the UK over the past few years. You can get an idea of how it's become more and more difficult for councils to deal with that kind of issue. So I think kind of something around making sure people understand about permeable surfaces for driveways, permeable surfaces in the gardens. And also I often think, put a lot of juice into your garden for habitats, for the insects as well, for the birds and the bees. There's multiple benefits to this. And similar to Barney, I lived in Kendal through the floods of 2015, and I saw things that I'd never seen before in terms of what was happening. It was kind of something kind of strange. It was beyond the reference points of what I'd seen before. And most of that, for a lot of people, started with the surface water drainage system rather than the main river going through the town. And again, you know, if you see, I think that the point was made by the councillor, if you see something blocking a surface water drain, I've seen a few in Kendal. All you have to do is move some sticks and move some leaves, and it can make a massive difference. So yeah, if you see something, just clear it. So yeah, just small things that people can do.
Absolutely, and they all make a difference. Don't think that these actions don't make a difference. They genuinely do. So a bit of stuff in the chat now. I'm seeing from Ian suggesting that we give the local communities the power and equipment to close roads. With you every step of the way, Ian. I'm going to move straight on to then. Stephen makes a very interesting point here, which is about giving some thought to the inevitable movement of people. So there are areas, now this is trying to give a global perspective, but bringing it down to the local. There are areas of the world that will become more or less uninhabitable for people. And people, just to survive, will be in need to move. There are some seriously dramatic numbers in terms of estimates around the number of global climate migrants we are likely to see. But he raises a really interesting point, which is maybe areas like ours, which have the capacity to take a lot more people, need to start giving some thought about that exact issue. If I'm reading that correctly, please shout up, Stephen, if I'm not grabbing that correct. I'm trying to sort of half read it whilst talking to the room, but I think I've just about got the point there. It's all in the chat. It's a long point, but a very good point. Happy if anyone's interested to come in on that point. I actually totally agree. I'm seeing some reactions there. Let me try and keep up to date. Yeah, some definite. Yeah, oh, I'm getting it right. Excellent. Always nice to know it's going well.
Can I just quickly come in?
Yeah, Irina, please.
Yeah, because it's just, yeah, it's a really, wonderful to hear like that point so well made, because yeah, absolutely. There's of course like different responsibilities of different countries for, you know, this climate crisis, and when we're talking about the country like UK that has, you know, contributed so much to it, that it's a matter of also this sort of social justice issue, right, of opening up the spaces for welcoming people who are living already and are going to live in uninhabitable climates. So it's, I think, that kind of linking up of the agenda around foreign policy and migration policy with the climate change adaptation agenda. It's a bit more difficult issue to discuss from Scotland, that does not have its own like power to decide about its migration policy, right? It's still the UK law that governs that.
Have to divert us away from that level of the politics for this evening.
But
you're right. Okay, I'm going to make one little point again, which is again linked to the points about hard surfaces, but it's practical again to our homes, our businesses, our buildings. And again, I'll do this in the form of a little story. So my local in Todmorden, the pub at the bottom of my hill called the Golden Lion, when we got hit by the first of the extreme floods, essentially what happened was, I'll never forget watching manhole covers explode upwards with the force of water underneath them. And then the water decided to take a path right through the pub and into the canal. And the pub was entirely carpeted. And then in the cleanups, they had to rip up all the carpets and everything. And then they thought, should we put the carpets back down? And I thought, no, because underneath the carpets were stone flags, and it took them ages to clear up after the first one. And then they got flooded again. And this time what happened was they put a shout out, and 20, 30 people, regulars of the pub and others, just piled down, mopped, swept, cleaned it out, watered it down, and they were up trading again within 24 hours of being flooded, because they had hard surfaces that they just mopped the water off. I mean, admittedly, it was a pub, so people were quite happy to take the drinks without it being totally clean, but it was about the difference between trying to resist every extreme weather event and trying to make sure that the recovery is as quick, cheap, and easy as possible. So I saw a little bit of flicker in the chat there. Is the way to work with Drax. So Drax actually have a seat on the board of trustees of Loch Kent Trust. Alan and I have had some conversation with them. We're all about working in partnership together. So yes, we will find ways to work with Drax to get that information, to get the alerts. And I was talking to someone today who was saying that some of the alerts that come through at the moment are just, there's flooding on the Galloway hydro scheme, or potential flooding on the Galloway hydro scheme. Now, the Galloway hydro scheme is a large scheme. So just today, I've made a note of it. I want to have a conversation with the guys at Drax to see if there's a way we can get better, more granular data coming through. What else is going on? There used to be a telephone tree to warn people. Yeah, the ring around systems have worked very well in lots of areas. Like I say, in the Calder Valley, we actually have air raid sirens, which is a very interesting experience, hearing an air raid siren going off. But by God, everyone knew there was flooding coming. System-wide, yes. So Scottish Government today, okay, beavers, right? Okay, yes. No, I've seen a few comedy comments about beavers and the Scottish Government this morning. So guides from Scottish Government. So Arena's firing up a bunch of links into the chat of various helpful documents. I think we're looking at the time. I think we're sort of fast approaching what we'd anticipated as the sort of closing time for today. I've got little more to say other than to really drive the point home that this is not the end of the process. This is essentially, this is the first time that this Climate Ready Ken project has gone out to you as the public. So this is the first time we've stood here and said, tell us what you need, tell us what you want. So please, if you think of something after today, fine, get in touch, go on our website, go on our Facebook, find a way to talk to us, stop us in the street. We don't care, just tell us what you want. We'll make no promises, but we'll put it on the list and do our best. And the other key thing is talk to people, tell people about it. We aim to be here for the long term to support you, our communities, to be as sustainable as possible. That means getting ready for what's coming and what's already here. And to do anything else would be madness. And on that dramatic note, I think I'm almost at the stage to call proceedings to an end. So unless anyone has any last burning comments they want to fire in, I would just like us all to thank in the traditional way our two speakers tonight, Jeff and Arena. So thank you very much. Thanks to McNabb for running the technology. And thank you all for attending. Really appreciate it. Look forward to working with you in the future.